Christmas 1916 found the people of Europe weary of war and sick at heart. Gone was the romantic thirst for glory that inspired millions of young men across the continent to take up arms at the outbreak of the Great War 29 months before. Gone too was the wild belief that a better, brighter world would somehow emerge from the Great War's carnage. In its place, a morbid fatalism that saw a future filled with death and dying reigned supreme. Men now concluded, as a young English officer confessed, that Armageddon was too immense for anyone's solitary understanding. The Great War seemed destined to be with them always. George Bernard Shaw had come away from a visit with England's Commander-in-Chief, Sir Douglas Haig, at the front, that fall feeling certain that the war would last 30 years. Even the Times of London set aside its usual rose-colored optimism on New Year's Day 1917 to remark that after 29 months of fighting, which has involved nearly all the states of Europe, anything like a definite decision seems far distant. England's enemies feared the same. "I see no end to it," a captured German army doctor told an English writer. "It is the suicide of nations." The exalted hopes with which Europeans had greeted the Great War's coming now made their disillusionment more bitter still. Before the guns of August had shattered the peace of Europe in 1914, Germany's great novelist, Thomas Mann, remembered. Gray, at the very moment it had given them the means to destroy it on an unprecedented scale. Man, as it were, is shoved into the background in modern war. Even though it is ultimately his decision which is at stake. Nowhere was that truth more certain than on Europe's eastern front, where thousands of unarmed Russian soldiers stood defenseless in reserve trenches, waiting the moment when they would charge forth to seize the rifles of their fallen comrades and continue their charge. While they waited till casualties on the firing line should make rifles available, Britain's General Sir Alfred Knox reported an outraged amusement that they were churned into gruel by German heavy guns. Such men never faced their enemies on the field of battle. Death came to them unforeseen, inflicted by foes who, from their positions far beyond the horizon, never once glimpsed their victims, but merely adjusted the elevation of their heavy guns according to numerical coordinates set down on their maps. Much more than on the Western Front, the Germans had tested their killing machines in the East during 1915, the year before the front between Tarnów and Glorious in May, and again. He drove northward toward Lublin, Cholm, Brest-Litovsk. 2 months later, the hard-eyed General August von Mackensen perfected his Mackenson's wedge, in which massed heavy guns hurled more than 1,000 high-explosive shells a minute into the enemy's positions before his soldiers began to advance. Mackensen was a strategy calculated not to challenge his enemies, but to eradicate them. Creeping like some great beast, the German army would move, one Russian general remembered. Their heavy guns would start to shower their shells on the Russian trenches until nothing of the trenches remained and their defenders would be destroyed. Then the beast would cautiously stretch out his paws. The infantry units, which would seize the demolished trenches. Again and again, during Russia's great retreat in the summer of 1915, Europe's Eastern Front witnessed this unequal confrontation between technology and man as the heavy weapons of the German army battered their way ahead. The Germans literally plow up the field of battle with a hail of metal and level our trenches and defenses. often burying their defenders in the process. One desperate Russian division commander reported. They use up metal, he concluded bitterly. We use up human life. As the cost in lives soared, Russians' disillusionment with modern warfare turned to outright defeatism that demanded an end of the war at any price. Complete demoralization is in progress, a member of one of Russia's most prominent civic groups reported on the fall of 1916. Soldiers began to demand a peace long ago, but never was this done so openly and with such force as now. The Tsar's secret police, the fearsome Okhrana, whose business it was to report on Russia's attitudes toward their government and its policies, understood the sentiments of the country and sensed the danger of revolution all too clearly. Everybody is impatiently waiting for an end to this damned war, one of its senior officials stated in a secret report on 1916. There is a marked increase in hostile feelings among the peasants, not only against the government, but against all other social groups. No one expressed Russians' hatred for war more forcefully than Vladimir Mayakovsky, the 23-year-old futurist poet who had become a revolutionary at the age of 15 and had been in Tsarist jails on 3 separate occasions before his 16th birthday. Like so many others who had been caught up in the war's first surge of patriotic enthusiasm, Mayakovsky, in 1914, had cursed the Germans for their barbarity and tried to enter the army as a volunteer. More quickly than most of his countrymen, however, he had condemned everyone in any country who supported it. Every person, even someone who is of no use, has the right to live, he raged. You simply cannot bury him alive in trenches and dugouts. Murderers! For Mayakovsky, the war had taken on a life of its own by 1916, and he feared it would consume victors and vanquished equally. Not even victory, he insisted, could justify war's cost in lives and treasure lost. To an armless stump left over on the bloody banquet, he exclaimed angrily, "What the hell good is it?" Filled with hatred for the politicians and generals who continue to send men to their deaths and the uneven struggle against the killing machines of Germany, Mayakovsky's indictment of the war nonetheless contained a flash of optimism that accorded strangely with the pessimism overwhelming East and West as 1916 neared its end. For if Russia's angry young poet remained second to none in his outrage of the Great War's brutality, he nonetheless closed with a rare vision of a new and better world that might emerge from its carnage. At the end, Mayakovsky promised this brave new world would bring freedom. The free man about whom I shout will come, he concluded. Believe me. Believe me. Behind Mayakovsky's new vision of a world of freedom lay his belief that the thorny crown of revolution soon would settle upon Russia and its people. For, if the Great Retreat of 1915 marked the low point in Russia's military effort, 1916 brought political crises of equal magnitude. Ever since the Emperor Nicholas II had taken command of his country's collapsing armies in August 1915, he had allowed his neurotically introspective empress to turn his empire onto one of the most bizarre courses ever taken by a nation at war. A woman who believed that God had chosen her as his instrument, the Empress Alexandra surrounded herself with an assortment of prattling holy men and corrupt hangers-on who flattered her belief that God had chosen her to save Russia. With An urgency that proved all but impossible to resist. She pressed her weak-willed husband to appoint ineffectual non-entities and gross incompetence to high office, and changed their appointments so rapidly that one sharp-tongued conservative politician dubbed the entire farce ministerial leapfrog. Alexandra praised Alexei Kostov, a corrupt influence peddler whose lust for food and drink was exceeded only by his greed for power. As a man whose soul was light and clear, when she insisted, in the fall of 1915, with his appointment as Minister of Internal Affairs, she could not be delayed for a moment. A few months later, she urgently pleaded for the honest and excellent Boris Strumer, a man whom others described as worse than mediocrity, with limited intelligence, mean spirit, low character, unquestionable honesty, no experience, and no idea of statecraft, to be named Prime Minister. Not long after, she concluded, his replacement, Alexander Protopopov, a man, according to rumor, once claimed that he had seen Christ standing behind her. Protopopov proceeded to insult Russia's uniform of the representative imperial Alexandra calmly insisted that Protopopov is honestly for us and that his efforts will be blessed. One of Protopopov's greatest virtues as a statesman, Alexander assured Nicholas, was that he venerates our friend Rasputin, the sinister pseudo-saint, whose every word, she thought, bore God's imprint. From all of the men she chose to direct Russia's affairs, Alexandra demanded unswerving devotion to Rasputin, whose prayers and wise counsels, she insisted, were the rock of faith and help that would save Russia. A charlatan pretended to stand close to God and the Russian people. Rasputin had, for more than a decade, used his strange, hypnotic ability to stem the bleeding of Russia's hemophilic Tsarevich, to gain the Empress's unreserved confidence. In the Tsar's absence, he readily used that trust to raise high office men who had paid handsomely for his favor, and through them, he seems to have pursued an array of unsavory schemes that boded ill for Russia and his imperial patrons. Rasputin widely reported sexual excesses and outrageous public behavior to the very men and women who had formed the bulwark of Russia's throne for centuries. Yet, no amount of pleading from the statesmen, courtiers, and even members of the imperial family would shake Alexandra's belief that God spoke through the man whom one disgusted conservative branded a filthy, depraved, corrupt peasant. Rasputin was a symbol of ominous dark forces lurking behind the throne, which too many Russians feared would drive their nation into the chaos of revolution and defeat. Oh, how terrible an autocracy is without an autocrat, a loyal monarchist confided to his diary as 1916 came to a close. The Tsar offends the nation by what he allows to go on in that palace, while the country offends the Tsar by its terrible suspicions. As Russia's old-fashioned Julian calendar passed Christmas 1916 and turned toward the New Year 13 days after Western nations had celebrated those events, many sober-minded citizens thought revolution would become a near certainty. "We're headed for revolution!" Former Prime Minister Vladimir Kostev had warned France's ambassador some months earlier, while they had sat at dinner with the great Petrograd industrialist Alexei Polotov. Polotov expected something even worse. "We're heading for anarchy," he insisted. "There's a vast difference. The revolution has the intention to reconstruct. The anarchist thinks of nothing but destruction." As the new year opened, there were thoughts that anarchy had already come. From the right, not the left. Anything is preferable to the state of anarchy that characterizes the present situation, he reported. as he describes it to his superiors, the outrageous flounderings of Probatar and of Alexander's other favorites. I am obliged to report, he concluded in amazement, that at the present moment, the Russian Empire is run by lunatics. Many Russians no longer even bothered to ask if there would be a revolution, but only debated when it would break out. The revolutionary path of struggle is inevitable, one influential liberal politician concluded. The only question is when to start the fight. Even members of the imperial family saw the danger. We are watching an unheard of plot. One of the emperor's cousins lamented on New Year's Day 1917. We are looking on while the revolution comes from above, not from below. Then, for a brief moment, at the beginning of February, a false calm settled upon Russia. As sub-zero temperatures slowed the pace of life and blizzards piled the snow deep in drifts across the land, men, machines, and political conflicts all came to a standstill, and Russia's rulers took heart. You are exaggerating the danger, Alexandra confidently chided Grand Duke Alexander, when she had warned that the revolution lay just beyond the horizon. When you are less excited, you will admit I am better. You, besides Alexandra, were deceived. As snow-clogged railways and disabled locomotives halted vital food and fuel shipments, Russia's cities froze, and people went hungry. Bread prices climbed by more than 200% each week after the first of the year. Potatoes and cabbage by 3, milk by 5, meat and sausage by 7, and chocolate and sugar by more than 10. As in earlier, less preposterous times, workers no longer ate eggs. Meat, milk, and fruit were settled for watery cabbage soup and bits of black bread that were increasingly hard to come by. In Moscow and Petrograd, bread lines began to form, even though the temperature stood well below zero. Children are starving in the literal sense of the word. Enoch Haran, agent, reported as he grimly warned his superiors to prepare for hunger riots that could turn all too easily into revolution. Underneath, everything is seething, a worried Moscow newspaper editor wrote. The tighter the government screws down on the top, the bigger the explosion is going to be. Although throughout the thoughtful minds of thoughtful Russians, there was a sense that an explosion was all but certain, they remained as innocent about the nature of modern revolution at the beginning of 1917 as they had been ignorant about the terrors of modern warfare when they had sought national regeneration on the Great War's first battlefields. Certainly, they knew the history of Europe's revolutions, and even the most recent of those, in 1848, had come during the early days of the Industrial Revolution, when men and women still thought mainly in pre-industrial terms. During the Great French Revolution of 1789, the absence of modern transportation and communications had kept the angry masses of town and country apart, and Europe's 19th century revolutions had been staged by city crowds for the same reason. In 1917, no one knew what might happen when modern transportation and communications allowed the urban and rural mobs to unite in common cause. Nor could anyone imagine what the revolution would be like when each side had modern weapons at its disposal, and the insurgents numbered in the millions. No one, in fact, could even envision what sort of government which revolution might produce. Hopeful, perhaps, that they might find in the revolutionary abyss the uplifting forces that had failed to find in the Great War's carnage, less timid men and women moved towards the events that forced the abdication of Nicholas II on March 2nd with a thrill of anticipation. Yet, despite their clear sense of its inevitability, they at first did not recognize the revolution when it began, starting as a protest by 7,000 underpaid textile mill workers on the morning of Thursday, February 23, 1917. The ranks of Petrograd's revolutionary demonstrators swelled to over 70,000 by nightfall. The mob doubled the next day. On the next, it almost doubled again until it numbered more than 250,000. On Sunday, the fourth day, the Petrograd garrison joined the revolution, and only the city's police force of less than 2,000 remained to defend the government. Now far stronger than the police, and with the armies machine guns and armored cars on their side, Petrograd's working men and women opened the city's prisons and called the First Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies into session. Although some of Duma's most prominent politicians desperately tried to regain control by forming a provisional committee for the restoration of order, they could do little but preside over the demise of Imperial Russia. Less than a week after Petrograd's angry workers took to the streets, Nicholas abdicated, and the Duma's provisional committee became Russia's first provisional government. Joyfully, Petrograd's crowds felt the weight of the fallen imperial government drop from their shoulders. The government no longer gives any signs of life. One of the city's most celebrated poets confided, "Somehow, somewhere, someone is giving orders. It's like some gigantic corpse is suffocating, and that's all." A strange sense of sensation. Almost as Mayakovsky's predictions were stated, the closing stanzas, freedom came suddenly upon the men and women of Russia. "We have triumphed!" the young poet exclaimed, as cheering crowds tore Russia's famed two-headed eagles from buildings and across Petrograd. "Glory to us all! Glory to us all!" Freed from symbols too long associated with oppression, the Russians now set out upon a path as yet untrod by any modern nation. No one yet knew who would govern, nor did they know to whom their as yet unnamed leaders would be responsible. Men like the loyal monarchist Vasily Shulgin hoped that sober statesmen, industrialists, and professional men and women would unite to lead Russia's founding state formation without a name. Along the moderate political path that the nations of Western Europe had taken after the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, others, like Mayakovsky, hoped that the revolution of February 1917 marked only the first step on a journey that would carry Russia through a socialist revolution to a brave new world, shaped not by example of Europe's democracies, but according to the vision of proletarian democracy, in which workers' rights to food, housing, and medical care replaced the sacred Western freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly. Unable to predict which of these courses Russia might take, the men of substance, who made up the first cabinet of the Revolutionary Provisional Government at the beginning of March 1917, dedicated themselves to Shulgin's more moderate course and insisted that the newly liberated Russia must remain loyal to her allies. Victory in the Great War, they said, must be won before the government could turn to the urgent domestic crises that made possible the Romanovs' overthrow, and the Russians therefore must prepare for new and bloodier battles to come that spring and summer. Together with her common soldiers, Russia's working men and women thought differently. Although they remained uncertain about taking power into their own hands and continuing Russia's march towards a socialist revolution, Petrograd's Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies bitterly opposed any effort to set aside the issues that had driven their comrades to overthrow the Romanovs. Formed at the end of February to represent the city's workers and soldiers, Petrograd's Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies became the assembly to which the civilian and military masses of the capital gave their first allegiance. And it was within its walls that Russia's revolutionary workers, soldiers, and sailors took their first steps to seize political power. And ironically, they did so in spite of their leaders' calls for caution. Too long used to debating the complexities of revolutionary theory while they remained unschooled in revolutionary practice, the men who stepped forward to lead the Petrograd Soviet during the revolution's first weeks proved to be timid advocates for Russia's proletarians. Content, for the moment, with the provisional government's promise of complete political freedom, these halting theorists preached that revolution neither had the practical strength to bring the rapid socialistic transformation of Russia, nor were the conditions yet right for doing so. Political power, they insisted, must be delivered first to the hands of those sober politicians who represented Russia's men and women of property, and they moved with unseemly haste to see that accomplished. Petrograd's workers and soldiers proved much less willing than the Soviet leaders to surrender their newly won revolutionary victories. Led by representatives of Russia's common soldiers, they approved Prezek No. 1, Order No. 1, the most fateful document to emerge from the February Revolution. Only in those cases where they do not conflict with the orders and resolutions of the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies, should the soldiers and sailors of Russia's armed forces execute the orders of the provisional government. Russia's newly established provisional government thus remained responsible for governing on a day-to-day basis, but could enforce only those policies that the Soviets sanctioned. The awkward and contradictory result, what politicians and historians would call dual power, left both the provisional government and the Soviet unable to govern effectively, while each struggled desperately to prevent the other from accomplishing its revolutionary idea. While Russia's crises deepened that spring and summer, men and women debated their nation's future. Across the entire country, an unending, disorderly meeting went on day and night, one young journalist wrote, as he remembered how the February revolutions had loosened Russia's tongues beyond anyone's expectations. Although prices had begun to soar, talk became incredibly cheap. For the moment, to speak openly, to write freely, and to discuss disagreements became ends in themselves for men and women who had been kept in silence for centuries. Everywhere, people spoke of hopes and plans and dreams to be fulfilled in an unceasing orgy of words. Faith in the future, as yet uncertain and undefined, captivated Russians' imaginations. Everyone is overcome by a recognition that the miracle has occurred, and, consequently, that more miracles will follow, wrote Alexander Blok, the passionate symbolist poet, whose verse, one admirer later confessed, had affected Petrograd's avant-garde, as the moon affects lunatics. In these days before the Great War, freedom is extraordinarily okay, that fucking doesn't make sense. No one now personified the verbal tempest that swept across Russia in those days more than Alexander Kerensky, the obscure provincial lawyer who rode the crest of the revolutionary wave to become Prime Minister of Russia. Kerensky had first come to Petrograd as a deputy of the Duma in 1912, where his virtuosity at shaping words to accomplish his listeners' moods and preferences had won him enthusiastic supporters among several left-wing groups. During the Great War, he had nurtured his following with such successes that the Orkhana had identified him as the man most likely to unify Russia's badly splintered revolutionary movement, long before the revolutionary actually broke out. After the February Revolution, Kerensky's rising star soared. as he used his sensitivity to the revolution's progress to further his quest for political power. Only Kerensky, Shogun concluded with a reluctant admiration, knew how to dance upon the revolutionary quagmire. In those days, for several months, he did so with unmatched virtuosity, as he stirred crowds to anger, fierce patriotism, revolutionary zeal, or charity for the vanquished statesmen of the old regime, as it suited his purpose. With consummate skill, Kerensky maneuvered to become the only person in Russia who could move freely across the barrier that had been erected between the Soviet and the provisional government. As vice president of the Petrograd Soviet, he claimed to be the hostage of the revolutionary democracy and the camp of the bourgeoisie, while as Minister of Justice in the provisional government's first cabinet, he announced his moral mission to keep the revolution undefiled by shameful bloodshed and prevent revolutionary extremists from taking revenge against their former oppressors. One contemporary recalled him as having pallid skin. In factories, at street rallies, and in the Soviet, Kerensky preached the doctrine of Russia's revolutionary rebirth. Everywhere he summoned men and women to believe in the future, never telling its content or offering a clear program, but always speaking with a passion that infected his listeners, with his enthusiasm for the new order that would, by definition, be better than the past or present. Unleashing verbal torrents upon his audiences as he struggled to keep the revolution's natural anarchy from diverting its progress, Kerensky always gave the impression that he stood at the revolution's vortex. Konstantin Pastovsky, a young streetcar conductor in Tsarist Russia, whose literary portrayals of the agonies that men and women suffered during wartime eventually won him the Lenin Prize, remembered Kerensky's lemon-colored puffy face, close-cropped thinning grayish hair, as he struggled to knock back the broken pieces of Russia back together with his ecstatic eloquence. What Kerensky's enemies called his formless radicalism of phrase, he worked his magic upon the hearts of men and women ready to be captivated by a golden tongue, but it could do nothing to feed, clothe, house, or protect them. Even before the revolution, inflation had begun to drive too many men and women who had clawed their way to the lower middle class back to the depths of poverty. Now, the shortages grew worse, and prices soared until inflation threatened Russia's workers with starvation. In 1914, a single ruble had bought enough food to produce 1,400 calories. Now, it bought a mere 168. A terrible war, an acute food shortage, a paralyzed transportation system, an empty treasury, and a population in a state of furious discontent and anarchic disintegration was the heritage of Nicholas's fallen government. Although gross efforts at self-justification were to mar much of what he had published after the revolution, in that instance, Kerensky bore the simple truth. Throughout 1917, people spoke of the broad Russian nature and its potential for exploring untried courses. Yet, it was self-discipline, not revolutionary enthusiasm, that was needed to save Russia from themselves that spring. Clearly, the revolution's anarchic turbulence had to be brought under control. Workers had to be gotten back to their looms and their lathes. Peasants had to be urged to get on with their spring planting. And trains had to be made to move again. At the front, where soldiers had taken to electing commanders and voting about whether to obey orders to attack, discipline had to be restored. In the rear, the rule of law had to be reestablished among peasants, who felt free to seize others' lands, and workers who demanded control of the factories in which they were supposed to work. What was wanted? England's Assaton's military attaché to Russia later remarked. was a little narrow common sense. Yet, there seemed to be no way to bring Russia's unruly masses to heel without betraying the revolution's most cherished principles, failing to understand, as Pautahovsky later wrote, that the establishment of justice and freedom was going to require a great deal of hard work and even some brutality. Russians continued to celebrate their newly won freedom, and the matter certain to destroy it. Moscow's thieves held mass meetings to discuss liberty, equality, and brotherhood, while they plied their trade with greater enthusiasm than ever. So did the city's prostitutes. That summer, as the Russians prepared to launch a new offensive, with divisions whose discipline had crumbled, the Petrograd Soviet abolished the death penalty for deserters and for soldiers who refused to attack. Worst of all, the Great War continued. In addition to more than 1 million refugees who had perished from starvation and disease, Russia's losses in men, killed, wounded, and taken captive had passed 6 million before the revolution had broken out in February. Enemy victories had cost Russia 500,000 square miles of territory that had produced a tenth of her iron ore, a fifth of her coal, and 2/3 of her chemicals before the war. The great industrial centers of Warsaw, Rodan, Lublin, and Lodz all lay behind enemy lines, as did some of Russia's most fertile farmlands. War had touched the life of each Russian directly, and there was not the comforting sense of isolation from the fighting as there was in England, where such fashionable London shops as Fortnum and Mason's and Harrods sent special gift packages of gingerbread, cakes, tarts, and even fresh flowers to the men who fought beyond the English Channel. For Russians, in 1917, the Great War had become too frightful, too pervasive, and too near. Although the Petrograd crowd had toppled the government of Nicholas in February 1917, I bore placards that proclaimed, "Down with the war." The statesmen who replaced the Tsar's fallen minister failed to take the message seriously. Pavel Volokov, leader of Russia's liberal constitutional Democrats, and a longtime student of his nation's policies in the Near East, insisted that it was necessary to save Russia by carrying on the war to victory. And as the provisional government's stern and professorial minister of foreign affairs, he had promised his nation's allies that Russia would continue to fight against the common enemy until the end, without cessation and without faltering. In doing so, he enraged the Petrograd Soviet, whose representatives had called upon the toilers of all countries to refuse to serve as an instrument of violence and conquest in the hands of kings, landlords, and bankers, and had promised that, by our unified efforts, Russia's workers would put an end to this frightful carnage. When Milukov insisted that Russia would fight to the last drop of her blood and spoke of her firm resolve to bring the World War to a decisive victory, Petrograd's workers and soldiers stormed to the streets. Armed and angry, they provoked an April crisis that drove Milukov and his supporters from office. That Milukov's determination to continue the war had cost him the foreign ministry did not mean that Kerensky, whose voice dominated the new cabinet, was prepared to make peace. As Russia's new Minister of War and Navy, he insisted that his nation must fight on, not for the annexations with which her allies had promised to reward her, but to protect the revolution and avoid the great territorial losses that defeat would bring. For the sake of the nation's life, he later explained, it was needed to restore the army's will to die. Soldiers must be convinced to fight again, and commanders must be given the authority to order men into battle if Russia was ever to have an efficient fighting force. Kerensky knew that an unshakable, almost automatic conviction of the inevitability and necessity of sacrifice must rule the hearts of Russia's soldiers. If Russia was not to be left standing defenseless before her enemies, determined to make it possible again for everybody to look death in the face calmly and unflinchingly, he stormed back and forth along the front that spring and summer. Forward to the battle for freedom, he proclaimed in his grandest manner. I summon you not to a feast, but to the end. To him, it seemed certain that soldiers who had fought for a Tsar had gladly sacrificed their lives for the revolution. Let the freest army in the world prove that there is strength and not weakness in liberty, he exclaimed. Let them forge a new iron discipline of duty. As the commander-in-chief of the forces on Russia's western front explained some years later, the word created by hypnosis and self-hypnosis. And for a brief moment, it seemed that Kerensky's ringing summons to war had stirred the hearts of men long wearied of the Great War's killing. But it was one thing to stir men's hearts, and another to convince them to face machine gun bullets and artillery shells. Russia's millions of peasants in uniform to find freedom in the very concrete sense of being free to seize for themselves the land that belonged to aristocrats and landlords, and that posed a dilemma that no amount of golden rhetoric could resolve. What's the use of peasants getting land? One peasant soldier asked. If I'm killed, I get no land. Given the choice between answering Kerensky's summons to die for freedom and seizing the lands that they and their ancestors had looked upon with such longing for so many years, Russia's land-hungry peasant soldiers walked away from war by the tens of thousands during the summer of 1917. They recalled to mind a vast migration of peoples. The mischievous memorialist Nikolai Sukhanev wrote in amazement. Always, this ever-growing wave of humanity flowed eastward, anxious to forget the fighting and the killing in order to return to their village and seize whatever lands opportunity might put in their way. The war was becoming more and more unbearable, Sukhanov remembered. The elemental forces against the war, against its support, and against its entire organization were accumulating. As hordes of soldiers left the front and public opposition to the war deepened in the rear, Kerensky announced a new offensive. Thanks to the Allies' efforts, the Russians' heavy guns outnumbered the enemy's, and they had enough shells to support their advancing troops properly for the first time since the first days of the war. Too quickly, Kerensky rushed to proclaim a handful of successes as a great triumph for the revolution, only to see his nation's war-weary soldiers turn their backs on victory. When some units received orders to attack, they elected committees to discuss them. Others retreated even before the Germans and Austrians launched their first counterattacks. And still others actually overran enemy positions and then withdrew without having a shot been fired. The army is on the run, one commander reported. It is hard to conjecture where the enemy might be stopped. The army remained nothing but human dust, one disgusted commander concluded less than a month before Kerensky's offensive. Another estimated that if all of them were retreated or brought to trial, half the army would end up in Siberia. As summer neared its end, men at both ends of the political spectrum acted upon visions of Russia's future that diverged sharply from Kerensky's own. As Kerensky himself later confessed that summer's defeats had caused many of his countrymen to yearn for a general on the white horse, to weld their nation's helmet and institutional shards back together. To some, General Kornilov, the darling son of a Siberian Cossack, whose courage, coolness, and contempt for death General Dinkin later explained, had made him a legend in a nation starved for heroes. Seemed to be the man to do so. While Kerensky hesitated to take the stern measures required to halt the army's collapse that summer for fear of angering his supporters in the Petrograd Soviet, Kornilov had unashamedly hanged deserters at every crossroads in the rear of his Eighth Army. The lives of a few cowards and traitors, he stated bluntly when criticized for his action, was a small price to pay to save many innocent lives. Now, perhaps, hoping that Kornilov's hero's aura would brighten his own dimming star, Kerensky appointed him supreme commander of Russia's armies in mid-July, only to find that Kornilov was neither biddable nor cooperative when it came to allowing politics to moderate the stern principles that ruled his life. Hello, brother. The two men were bound to clash. Kornilov's first direct confrontation with Kerensky came in mid-August, when both addressed the state conference in Moscow, where, in sharp contrast to Petrograd, a more moderate political atmosphere prevailed, as men and women spoke of property, order, and security in words not heard since the February Revolution. Kornilov's flatly stated warning that only an army welded together by iron discipline could save Russia from disaster. At the end of August, Kerensky's suspicion that Russia's supreme commander was about to seize the reins of government, and Kornilov's uncertainty that Kerensky had betrayed his vow to restore order to the army, culminated in the Kornilov Revolt, in which Kornilov marched upon Petrograd to save the city from the pact he believed Kerensky had struck with the Bolsheviks. With the resources of Russia's frontline commanders at his disposal, Kornilov's victory seemed certain, yet, to the unanimous surprise of Allied diplomats and military attachés in Petrograd, Kerensky triumphed. In less than a week, he took near dictatorial powers and the title of Supreme Commander of Russia's armed forces, while Kornilov and several of the generals who had stood closest to him found themselves imprisoned on charges of treason. With Kornilov's arrest, the last remnants of discipline in Russia's armies collapsed. Bitter, disillusioned, and tired of living facing machine guns, while machine guns pointed at their backs, as Alexei Tolstoy explained in the great novel about the Revolution and Civil War, Russia's peasant soldiers moved eastward toward peace and home. Home to the land, home to their women. The great tide of deserters that flowed away from the front that summer now swelled into a human flood, so vast that none could count its numbers. Tolstoy described the herds of crawling troop trains, their windows shattered, their doors torn from hinges.
I just want to ask what you're reading. What are you reading?
This is Red Victory.
Interesting. Is it for class? No? Just for
For
fun?
the future. This is the past. We don't want it to be the future. We don't. This is the timeline we want to avoid. Yeah.
All right, cool. Thanks.
As her armed masses flowed homeward in the days after the Kornilov Revolt, Russia's political horizon darkened. Never had Russian workers had so many weapons in their hands. Never before had so many been trained to use them. All the dark instincts of the crowd, irritated by the disintegration of life and the lies and filth of politics, were flared up and fueled, poisoning us with anger, hate, and revenge. The dean of Russia's proletarian writers, Maxim Gorky, predicted that poem. People will kill one another, unable to suppress their own animal stupidity. They will fire only because they have fear